If we're not living in joy, what needs to be released? What needs to be released? So I want to start by saying what Reverend Jones spoke to last week. She started her talk with a quote from Reverend Michael, and she probably paraphrased, so I'm paraphrasing again. So here it is, though. Non-forgiveness is radical self-abuse.
Yes.
Non-forgiveness is radical self-abuse. So I was going to say we could spend a whole month talking about forgiveness, and we are. So we have been doing that the last few weeks. And I have the honor and the privilege now of coming up here on week 3 after Reverend Verona's wonderful talk, Reverend Jones' wonderful talk on forgiveness. And so I'm coming into the conversation at a place where we're talking about what it means to move into the new paradigm of oneness and what forgiveness looks like from there. I want to start by saying a few things, though, because I want to be really clear when I'm talking about this mystical level of forgiveness and what it means. It doesn't necessarily mean that we don't go through the other levels, right? And it doesn't necessarily mean that we do or don't, to be clear. Because sometimes people will say to me, are you saying that I am supposed to just turn away and not acknowledge the abuse that happened to me or the wrongs that have happened to me? And we're going to come back to that word wrong. Bookmark that for a moment. I'm not saying that. Because in my own journey, it did seem like I had to go through these different levels or stages of awareness of what forgiveness would be. So in my book, Conscious Being, I write about what God would be, how we would perceive God from the 4 different levels of conscious awareness, and also how we would see forgiveness. When I am deeply entrenched in what I call martyr level of consciousness, Dr. Michael calls it victim level of consciousness, I'm just going to break it down. I think forgiveness is next to impossible. Because you have wronged me, and how can I ever forgive that? Or I have done things that are unforgivable. How many of us have ever felt that way? I have felt like I am carrying the shame of generations that my people have done. And I think some of you know what I mean. Right? I'm carrying generational shame of what has happened for decades and centuries and eons. So I'm really wanting to be clear as I begin the conversation that if I stay at that level of consciousness of good and bad and right and wrong, I'm just going to say, yes, forgiveness is hard work. But what it also invites is a different possibility. I'm struck by the song Bridge Over Troubled Water. It doesn't say no more troubled water. So maybe I'll say that one again. It does not say no more troubled water. We're exploring. We just finished an 8-week class on Thursday evenings based on Reverend Michael's book, Spiritual Liberation. And there's a section that we kind of explored on Thursday evening that the goal is not to get rid of difficulty. Right. The intention is that we come into our life, we experience our life from a different level of conscious awareness, and therefore what we once called challenges no longer affect us. Because we are the bridge that can walk right over that troubled water. We don't need to get down in there and swim and scuba dive anymore. Because the troubled water is always there if we want to look at it. It's always right there. Just turn on constant negative news. Right? Turn it on. There it is. Oh, the troubled water. How could he? How dare he? And therefore, I cannot be happy. So I misquoted Reverend Michael in the beginning of today's service. He didn't say we're not here to get high, we're here to get transformed. He said we're not here to get high, we're here to get free. Yes. Freedom is not needing the troubled waters to be anything other than what they are. Yes. It's that I can be the bridge that walks right over it and not pulled away by the current.
Yes.
So the current is what we call collective consciousness. And collective consciousness says there are people that have wronged us, and you have done things that are wrong, and you need to beg for some forgiveness, or somehow find it in your heart to forgive them. What we're talking about here is a radical shift in the way we experience the world. A radical shift. And that radical shift can take a lifetime, and it can happen in an instant, because it's always one breath away. One breath away from knowing that I can let go of the story. I want to be clear. Reverend Joan talked about this last week. It does not mean we're going to try to bypass the pain. That's not what I'm saying. Because the pain can be the admission price, if you will, the transformational price into a new way of being and seeing. So what I used to say is, pain is bad, let me get rid of it. This feels good. Let me have more of that. That's the basic Buddhist concept of suffering. I want more of that and less of that. More of that and less of that. What if we were to have a radical shift in the way we see all of this and say, rather than S-H-I-T, is that okay if I say it? Rather than shit happens, what if we were to say, I know you think I'm going to say shift happens, fertilizer happens. Because it's really the same thing, except for we're using it in a different way. Okay, sorry to be so graphic there. But I think it demonstrates that what we call something is how it ends up being transformational or not. Because if I'm trying to reject it, I might not be fertilizing the soil of my own transformation. So I'm going to get really current and tell you what this means in practical terms. When I find myself activated, I do not use the word trigger. And the reason I don't use the word trigger is implying that you have done something to me, or that the way Christine just looked at me triggered something. But it didn't. She's just looking at me. I have a story about how she's looking at me. I happen to have a story that she's looking at me with love and acceptance and open-heartedness. But I don't know if that's true. I don't know if that's true. So it's something gets activated within me. And when something gets activated within me, I can choose to reject it by calling it bad. Oh, this is bad because I'm angry. I'm hurt. I feel myself tightening up. Here's the key. When I go into a story about it, I miss the opportunity for transformation. And I know Reverend Joan talked about this last week too. When I go into a story about it, then what do I usually do? I start telling that story. And I know Reverend Verona said it is okay to tell a story. The question is, how many times are you going to tell the story? And for how long are you going to tell the story? And for how long are you going to carry it around? Let me tell you, I carried a few of my stories around for a long time. And I don't know what it was that brought me to a place where I recognized that the only person that was suffering from the story was me. And I was getting a whole lot of people to co-sign my story, to agree with my story. Sometimes that's why we build community. We build entire communities around confirming the story. Confirming the story. Let's get together. Let's have a Facebook group about it, actually. I'm a victim, and here's why. So to be clear again, I'm not saying things don't happen in our world. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that there's not troubled waters. What I'm saying is we don't have to dive in and swim. We don't have to live there. We don't even have to wade in it if we don't want. The bridge has always been there. When we move into the mystical realm of consciousness, and I've already touched on this, when we move into the mystical realm of consciousness, we're not even looking for a bridge. We're looking for how we can be the bridge. That's who and what we are at Agape Bay Area. We are coming together intentionally to build a bridge over troubled water. And that bridge, we could call it consciousness bridge. So what that looks like is, we come together in agreement that we're not our stories, that we are love, that we are light, that we are joy. And as we come together with that intentionality, it gets more powerful, it gets stronger, and my favorite word, it gets concretized in our consciousness and our community. My story. I've never been my story, but I thought I was. Now this will be a little controversial for some of you, because there's a quote from Jesus, the Christ. Jesus is a demonstration of the mystical consciousness that came here, as were so many others. And his quote is, "Forgive them, for they know not what they do." And I'm taking it a little bit, I'm not going to say further, but a little different, and that is, "Forgive them, for they know not who they are."
That's true.
Anytime I've ever hurt myself or anyone else, it's because I did not remember the truth. I was believing in the idea of separation. I was believing in the idea of my own brokenness. And from that idea of brokenness, I was believing that somehow someone or something needed to fix that. How's that going to work for us? Now, I know we've all tried. I'm pretty sure we've all tried that, though, isn't it?
Yes.
I've personally tried it. I feel broken and I want someone or something to fix that.
Yes.
So when we come into a mystical community and all that means, because sometimes I think we think, what is mystical? As a matter of fact, if you Google mystical images, you get like unicorns and stuff. So I'm not sure what that's about, because we're talking about oneness, absolute oneness. And all that means, very simply, is that we have come to understand that the voice of, the deepest voice of who and what we are, that God voice, that love voice, is the truth. And we can actually begin to live from that and as that.
Amen.
And we do that through meditation, we do that through conscious community, we do that through unlearning, we do that through telling our story and then finally letting go of the story. We do that by standing in the absolute truth, and sometimes it's just a look into another beloved's eyes to see the truth. So what we once called the still small voice actually becomes power. We're not talking about human force. We're talking about God power.
Yes, yes, yes.
Love power. When we know that we know that we know, that is the internal GPS that will transform our lives into a different way of being and seeing. And then it becomes all welcome. I no longer need to resist anything happening in the world that might look like troubled water. I can simply recognize that I'm an alchemist. Each one of us is an alchemist. We can take any situation and we can change it into something beneficial. As a matter of fact, the most painful experiences of my life, many of them were the most transformative. I can look back and say, that was really painful. It was really painful. And I had a story that made it more painful. And I carried it, and I carried it, and I carried it, and then eventually I surrendered and let go. It brought about powerful transformation. Can I also acknowledge it right now? What if anything that felt like pain in our lives right now was actually the fertilizer that's transforming us? Because freedom is not changing the story, it's living beyond the story. Living beyond the story. What if at any time I ever got activated, I knew it was for my own transformation, and I said, thank you, not the other you, right? Pointing at the other person. It's, oh, thank you. Thank you. You are the deliverer of a transformational moment, because as Reverend Jones said last week, you pushed my button, but you didn't install it. And to take it further with that, someone may have originally installed it, but I'm the one that now has the control or the power to do something with that button or not. What if I were to decide that it's no longer a button?
Yes.
Or a button for transformation? So in closing, what I want to offer is a simple statement. Are you ready? We're going to take a breath even before the statement. Only ego needs forgiveness. Because it's my personality self that believes something or someone has wronged me or that I have done something that's wrong. Spirit doesn't actually need that. God actually doesn't need that. That God essence, that God source is without rightness and wrongness. It's all wholeness and perfection. So there's no forgiving at that level. So that's why I started today with the question, what if we don't need to forgive? And here's the paradox. We have an ego. So we get to experience all of that stuff, but we're not our ego. And as Dr. Sue Morter says, only ego would want ego to die. And so only ego believes that we need to forgive.